mengamati pelbagai bentuk bual bicara, kami dapati kebanyakannya tergantung dan tidak menyediakan satu pandangan balas yang muktamad ataupun tuntas. Namun kami yakin tak kesemua isu dapat kita tangani dan menyelesaikan suatu solusi yang nyata. Tetapi sekurang-kurangnya, kita harus berikan komitmen untuk terus mempunyai stamina menelaah sisi pandangan yang pelbagai tanpa kita perlu memihak secara partisan. Dan kerana itu kami menyediakan ruang Dialektika TV dengan menyediakan suatu bentuk bual bicara, prolog sebagai mukadimah, Dialektika sebagai kemuncak dan epilog untuk kita menilai sisi pandangan yang pelbagai ini agar kita dapat melihat sesuatu isu itu secara rasional. Maka kami tawarkan kepada anda Dialektika TV, pentas yang turut mengajak anda berpartisipasi memberikan pandangan balas tentang advokasi dasar.
Adalah simbol betapa ada beberapa orang pada kita yang kata kena ada kesatuan Melayu.
Saya melihat Malaysia sebagai... Jadi saya rasa penting kita memikirkan...
Tak ada reformasinya di situ. Namun begitu tidak bertindak, mana ada demokrasi?
We have wasted the crisis dengan tidak membuat laporan.
The biggest shareholders of a government is rakyat. The biggest shareholders of a government is rakyat.
Terlebih dahulu kita mulakan dengan mengucapkan selamat menyambut Taipusam kepada teman-teman yang meraihkannya pada hari ini. Mudah-mudahan kita akan terus sentiasa makmur dan sentosa dalam konteks pembangunan negara kita ini, dan kesempatan ini juga kita akan mula beralih sedikit walaupun masih dalam konteks kerangkanya political education dan juga political advocacy. Hari ini kita memilih untuk melihat dan menjengah semula tema-tema yang berkait tentang pelaburan dan ataupun ekonomi secara lebih luas, dan tentunya kita sudah pun banyak bercakap tentang ini buat seketika di sepanjang setahun yang lalu Dialektika ini ke udara. Hari ini kami menjengah satu artikel yang menarik perhatian dan saya, kalau boleh saya kongsikan sekarang ini, adalah merupakan artikel yang ditulis ataupun dikongsikan di FMT dengan tema dan tajuk Indonesia may soon match Malaysia in baiting investors, says economist. Itu adalah merupakan artikelnya, dan untuk tujuan perbincangan itu kami mengundang pihak yang telah ditemu bual oleh FMT, iaitu Dr. CARMELO merupakan CEO kepada CME, Center for Market Education, Dr. Carmelo, apa khabar?
Baik,
Ya,
selamat malam.
jadi selamat malam. Kita faham Dr. Carmelo lebih fasih berbahasa Indonesia. Kerana
Sedikit.
Half of the life, your other half is an Indonesian, but of course we can have a mix of English and Indonesian or even Malay. Terima kasih Dr. Carmelo kerana hadir pada malam ini. Jadi kalau teman-teman tetamu ingin bertanyakan soalan, boleh memanfaatkan ruang komen. Bahkan juga nanti selalunya doktor kami membenarkan tiket 2 minit ya. Tiket 2 minit itu saya tunjukkan. Kalau ada ingin masuk ke studio kita bertanya dan berdialog bersama tetamu, 019-942-5546, ini taliannya. Kita bercakap soal kedudukan status semasa dalam konteks ekonomi Malaysia. Dan perhaps maybe Dr. Carmelo, we can begin with regards to the article that I have just shared, from FMT. So it was pinpointing and trying to make a comparison between Malaysia and Indonesia. How did the article came about? Maybe we start with that, Dr. Carmelo.
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, terima kasih banyak. I'm very glad to be on Dialektika. The article came about because recently I had to work precisely on a comparison of the attractiveness of Malaysia and Indonesia toward FDIs, foreign direct investments. And my consideration is actually not based on absolute values. So if I have to be honest, probably Malaysia still remain in absolute terms an easier place to make business compared to Indonesia. But if we look at what can happen in the future, it seems that Malaysia is making things more complicated for businesses, and Indonesia is trying to make them easier. That is a little bit the background of that article.
Doctor, I think there has been a mix of perception or maybe report, because I think earlier in the first quarter of last year, there is a huge debate with regards to the outflow of FDI. It was said to be among the highest outflow, and immediately the subsequent days, the minister himself with regards to MITI, Datuk Seri Azmin, refuted, saying that we are still strong. So how can we as Malaysians, as Marhain, as I keep on calling, the general public, should perceive this? One party says and the other says another. Basically, from your point of view, being CME, how do you see our position? Are we better off now as compared to maybe a year ago?
Definitely yes. We have to be honest and give credit that things have changed over 1 year, over 1.5 years. The numbers speaks against Malaysia for 2020, but I believe that the numbers in 2021 will be better than what happened in 2020. But still, there is a regime of uncertainty on the investment community, and that is dictated mostly by the way in which the Malaysian government reacted to the pandemic in the very first period of the pandemic. So Malaysia, but Malaysia was not the only country doing that, closed itself, and somehow found easy also to give a blame on foreigners, foreign workers, but even expatriates on bringing the pandemic in the countries somehow. So the ban on foreign workers, making regulations for expatriates, for the hiring of expatriates more complicated, more restrictive, and furthermore, even the recent developments on the program MM2H, this has all these things have scared the investor communities, and indeed investors still remain at the window by looking at how this regulation and if these regulations are going to change, in particular on labor. I mean, we can't really hide ourselves behind the finger. There are industries, manufacturing, F&B, plantation, and constructions that without the foreign workers are basically dead in Malaysia. I mean, and this is not a negative thing, because it means that the structure of the labor market in Malaysia is as such that Malaysians don't need to do their jobs anymore.
All
If
right.
they don't want, I believe that they don't need. So Malaysian and foreign companies in Malaysia, they need that access to labor, otherwise they cannot run operations.
Yeah. Maybe if we can look further back, further down the road, you can see that Tesla, Amazon, and even Google, they're making huge inroads into Indonesia. And I think this is this must have been a pre-COVID arrangement. So what actually happened? It seems like Malaysian authorities, we were off guard somehow, that all these major giants, they opt Indonesia instead.
Somehow also the success of countries in attracting investments is cyclical. Okay, Malaysia had a big expansion as a regional hub from the 70s onwards, thanks to access to good quality labor, good infrastructure, political stability, easy of doing business, despite a small domestic market. So companies have been entering Malaysia in order to attack the region from Malaysia. Now, I think that probably with the emergence of the 1MDB scandals, certain conditions like political stability have, they fell down. Cost of labor obviously also remain not so affordable like in other part of the countries. Then you don't have the advantage. Malaysia doesn't have the advantage like Indonesia of a huge domestic market. And then the pandemic has somehow given the final shot on this point, because in the moment in which international movements are made more and more difficult, more and more complicated, then you naturally are pushed where the market is, where you have access not only to labor but to a huge domestic market like Indonesia. Indonesia can leverage on that. Malaysia can't. So Malaysia needs to think seriously which one are the point of attraction of investment toward my country. What should we do at this regard?
Yeah, you said it a couple of times. You're mentioning that Malaysia is making it even harder for investors to come in. What are the manifestations for you? If you were to point some of the things which we have done, how did Malaysia make it harder for investors to come in?
So first of all, the regulations on the labor. So closing the access to foreign labors, but not only that, making also the regulations for hiring expatriates more complicated. And I mentioned also the program MM2H, which is a very limited program, but it is a program toward which long-term expatriates look as a final destination for their career. You make it impossible. This becomes something that weighs negatively on your choice to come to Malaysia. So these are some of the factors. Of course, prolonged lockdown. I think Malaysia had the longest lockdown in the world. That is weighing in creating more and more uncertainty. And the continuous discussion on new taxes as well. I think, and the introduction also on new taxes with budget 2022. Also the probably excessive measure of the extra profit tax, the windfall tax. So these are all things that are scaring out investors. And I have repeated in many occasions, Malaysia doesn't need more taxes, but needs better taxes. We have a very low percentage of people and companies that pay taxes. We need to enforce the taxes that are already in place rather than introducing new taxes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. If our topic tonight is about tax per se, then we'll dig deeper into that questions. You were mentioning about Malaysia having among the most prolonged lockdown. How do we compare with Indonesia? Meaning to say, are you saying that we did it slightly wrong as compared to Indonesia?
Indonesia, in policy, Thomas Sowell was used to say that in policy making, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. So when we look at something like a lockdown, we should ask ourselves, first of all, what are we going to achieve? And second, how much is going to cost? and usually you don't take decisions where the costs are higher than the benefits. And the numbers indeed speak quite against the decisions of locking down the economy. There is no sensitive benefit in terms of stopping the spread of a virus. It's simply eventually a delay. Indonesia has chosen a very limited approach to lockdown. Lockdowns have been implemented only at the very beginning of the pandemic, then they let it go. And in fact, if we look at the numbers of deaths in Indonesia by COVID-19 over the past months, has been very, very low. Recently, we see, I think, 7-8 deaths per day. The numbers of deaths in the last year have been very constant, so they somehow let the virus go. And recently there has been an epidemiological study showing that the majority of the population has developed immunity. They develop antibodies against it. So they have achieved a better result in fighting the COVID-19 at the same time, because they didn't prolong the agony, and they have protected their economy as well.
Right. Dr. Carmelo, saya ingin memberi ruang kepada penonton kita juga. Ramai yang sudah mula bertanyakan soalan ini. Dr. Carmelo juga boleh berbahasa Indonesia, saya maklumkan tadi. Tapi penonton kita nampaknya bila kita mula bercakap bahasa Inggeris tadi, semua bertanya di dalam bahasa Inggeris juga. Tak ada masalah. As long as we understand each other, we don't have any problem, ya, Doktor. Almeon Ainas, I'm not so sure how to pronounce his name, but I think Almeon is our regular audience. How Omnibus Act in Indonesia really affected Indonesia for labor law? Is that better than what Malaysia offered to our workers? So what's your take on this?
I think that the point is not really if Omnibus is better than the current regulation in Malaysia, but the point is that Omnibus sends a signal, and the signal of Omnibus is we want to make things easier for investors. While the approach, as I mentioned, that has been taken in Malaysia was we want to make things more complicated for investors. So investment decisions are based on expectations, and expectations react to signals. So what we have actually to weigh on the scale are the different signals that the two countries have sent out to the investment community. So the Omnibus Law has a lot of unclear points, has encountered also some internal opposition, is not panacea. But the signal that the Omnibus Law launched is we are a country full of red tapes. We want to cut down that red tape and make things easier. I think that the new government, the Malaysian new government, somehow understood how the decisions that were taken in 2020 affected negatively, and we are trying to reverse. There are discussions on MOUs with Bangladesh, with Indonesia as well. So I think that they are trying to reverse. So we have also to be to recognize that I think with this government we are going probably to see a change, and we need to speed up on that change. If I mean the game is not over yet, and I think in Malaysia can find its spirit of openness that made Malaysia great in the past.
Well, interestingly, I think you mentioned it that initially at the introduction of omnibus in Indonesia, there has been a huge resentment among Indonesians themselves. So we go to second question from Ghazali Abu, which directly relates to politics. My question to Dr. Carmelo: how do investors view the multiple changes of Malaysian Prime Minister within the same election term? How much does that affect the investors' confidence and preference to invest in Malaysia compared to other countries?
Obviously, political instability is never good for the business environment. Is probably worse than corruption, I would say, because create even a higher climate of uncertainty, in the sense once corruption is consolidated, you know the way in which you move within the system. I know this can be a controversial thought, but I want to be very open. When governments keep on changing, then you don't understand anymore the rules of the game, or you expect that rules may change. Look at what happened with GST, SST. That has been, I think, a phenomenal shock. We abolished GST, but we don't simply abolish GST. We reintroduce something that is a way in between. This create uncertainty. So what happen if the new government come in? Will GST come back? We will remain SST. So these are little elements of uncertainty. Having said that, I think that the business community will have to get used to a more fragmented political scenario in the region. Somehow the ruling class that has ruled so far is the ruling class that emerged after independence, the independence of the Southeast Asian country after World War II. I think we are physiologically in a moment of change, so the traditional forces probably don't interpret anymore the political sentiment of the people on the ground. And before creating a new political order, we will go through certain political shocks. And this is also a positive signal, the democracy that allows for the changes to happen. But it is like, that kind of stabilization that you get after an earthquake. It takes time, and you have more mild movements of the soil in between. So somehow investors will have, but this is also the same for Indonesia, in the sense that no political party really has the majority. The political scenario is highly fragmented. There is uncertainty. So investors will have to learn to deal with political uncertainty in the near future.
Yeah, a slight sidestep, Doctor, since you're mentioning about GST. I personally feel that GST is more efficient than SST, but it was so sad that GST has been the main, I would say, campaign, in order to change the regime of the government at that point of time. And now people have been talking about perhaps maybe to reintroduce GST again as what's your take on GST in particular?
Well, I've been in favor of it since 2014. There is an op-ed that you can find online that I published in 2014 in favor of GST. I like it. It is an efficient way of collecting revenues. But first of all, I see an eventual reintroduction of GST to be balanced by a reduction in income tax. So in this moment, we cannot simply have more taxes. It is not the moment. So if GST has to come back, we have eventually to compensate with a reduction in income tax. Then I believe that the new GST should be multi-tier, so distinguishing the different level, not only exemption and one rate. Probably we should have another middle rate somewhere between the maximum and the exemption. And my main point is that the GST can play a functional role in educating the rakyat toward the creation of saving. This is something, I know that this brings the conversation a little bit probably outside of the scope that we had in mind, but one of the main difficulties of one of the most important fragility of the Malaysian economic system is the high level of debt of the households. It's one of the highest in the world and the highest in Asia. In 2020 was 93% of the GDP. It means that every family, for each dollar earned, they have another dollar of debt. This is creating enormous financial instability that is due not only to eventually the level of salaries, but also there are wrong financial attitudes, and we need an effort toward bringing a saving mentality toward the rakyat families in the country.
Right. We can always invite you back when if we were to discuss in greater details with regards to GST. But since we're talking about comparison, basically our topic is, tajuk kita asalnya adalah merupakan pelaburan yang kian pudar, due to the report saying that there has been a huge outflow of FDI from Malaysia. And we have been focusing so much on the laws, on the labors, cheaper labors, foreign labors to come in and do all the stuff over here in Malaysia. But at the same time, we have to also acknowledge Malaysia is facing this middle income trap, because we have been depending so much on low labor that we were not able to exert ourselves into automation, into higher value So it seems like if we were to talk about comparing Malaysia against Indonesia, I think it should not be about low labor as well. We have to, move up the value chain and talk about higher value automation, digitalization. So it seems like we have yet been able to shred this, dependency on foreign and low labor, Doctor.
Yeah, I think that there are different ways to think about it. And I've mentioned this also recently. The scenario, when you study economics in the textbook, they always put this alternative between mechanization and labor. So labor intensive productions or capital intensive productions. But the situation is a bit more complex than the textbook. And one important point in the Malaysian economy is the structure of the economy. The Malaysian economy is relying a lot on small and medium enterprises. You can't bring automation into small. You not
SMEs.
always can bring automation into SMEs because economically it doesn't make sense. Because the scale of operations is so small that to bring in machinery is simply anti-economical. So we need to preserve this gaze on the complexity of the system. Is not just black or white. It's more different degrees of gray that we have to look. So having said that, I think that it is important, first of all, to realize that we can't renounce a traditional manufacturing. When we talk about selective FDIs, I think is a big mistake. And we have realized with the pandemic that concentrate our manufacturing hub totally into a country like China creates a problem if these countries face troubles or wrong policies. Okay, so this has been a mistake. So we need to regain trust that having a manufacturing backbone is good. And to have a manufacturing backbone, you need a mix of machinery, technology, but you will always need also labor. It doesn't exist production that can do without labor. So on this, and also echoing something that has been debated recently, I think that we need to open definitively to the inflow of foreign workers because locals, Malaysians, are not available for certain kind of jobs. But at the certain time, in order to create a vibrant job market and not a slave market, because this is the risk with all these transfer of workers and then workers that cannot change jobs. We are not creating a job market, we are creating a market of slaves. We should grant a certain flexibility to these workers. So I'm not saying total freedom at the very beginning, because then employers can suffer from the fact that workers shift too fast and too soon. But imagining conditions at which these workers, once in the country or after a certain time, have access to the labor market. By having wider access to the labor market, there is a competition to attract them, and this will also increase potentially salaries, because competition brings employers fight to attract these workers toward certain production. So freedom of labor is the condition to avoid depressed salary. And when there is the push for salaries to grow, then you will have also that push toward technology and mechanization. So it's a process that needs to be done in steps. You cannot just ask the companies not to hire people and to introduce machineries. And you also have to be realistic on the composition of your manufacturing structures. If your economy is made of SMEs, a global scale mechanization is probably unrealistic.
Yeah, but Doctor, correct me if I'm wrong. I think recently there has been an emergency measure to bring in labours for the plantation, and we understand that plantation is among the strategic economic sectors in Malaysia. So when it comes to plantation, sawit or palm oil in particular, we're not talking about SMEs. We're talking about big conglomerates. So and I think if I recall correctly, the minister in charge saying that we will move up the value chain into mechanization, into automation in 4 years' time. And I think 4 years is too long, considering the pace of changes. And actually, plantation has been there for quite some time. Malaysia is at the spearhead together with Indonesia. But yet, automation is very sluggish in that particular sector. So, while I agree that SME will have greater challenges moving up the value chain into automation and digitalization, but the like of Felda or even Sime Dabi, they have bigger role in pushing our economy into automation. So, what do you have to say about that?
First of all, automation is not brought in by government planning. So the government can say 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It doesn't happen because the government wants it to happen. The economy follows its paths. So mechanization needs to find the right economic environment to push for it. And one of the measures that I advocate just now, I think can help. So a higher possibility for labor force to move around different jobs. I think this will be a push toward it. Second is opening these markets. These markets are at this moment oligopolies. How can we study solutions in which there is a higher access to competition with this market? Because it is only competition that will create innovation, feeling the threat, you know, and the possibility of being replaced at the top. By living in comfort, in a comfort zone as a multinational company or as a oligopolistic company, then you lack the incentive to move up in the value chain. So one is liberalization in the labor market, and liberalization of certain industries to allow a higher degree of competition. So we need to look more at the ecosystem around certain industries if we want indeed them to innovate.
Right. Let's have Farid Osman here. Farid Osman is asking about tax exemption for investors. Is it still available? Is still a viable incentive? What could an investment promotion agency, I think the like of MIDA perhaps, do from a policy perspective to attract foreign investors into Malaysia? Incentive.
I think,
silakan.
I think that MIDA has done a terrific job in the past, really huge, in creating the conditions to attract businesses within Malaysia. And there are tax incentive packages and schemes, but they've been added on over time. There are many solutions. Often the investors are even not informed about all the available options. I think that this is the moment to rationalize, rethink, and rationalize our incentive schemes. See what we need, and to make probably less incentive schemes, but better incentive schemes. So rethinking that. Of course, tax exemptions are important, but again, is the ecosystem that probably is even more important than tax exemption, because we can't talk about investment in 5G, let's say, and then we have roads that can collapse because of a flood, you know, because we are unable to drain water from the flood, because a company, first of all, is made of bricks. So you can't risk to lose your operations or to damage your operations because of a lack of stable infrastructure.
Yeah. Since you're mentioning about this, the kind of investment that Malaysia need to attract, since definitely we're losing out to Indonesia when it comes to labor, the cost of operation, and perhaps maybe even capex. And even the government has been pushing towards digital initiatives. But we understand that in this digital era, you don't need to have brick and mortar to operate here in Malaysia. And in fact, we have this classical example of how Grab, move away from local investment to find a better pasture elsewhere, just across the country, just down south. So, what's the kind of competitive advantage, or perhaps maybe even niche area where Malaysia should be focusing on, since you're saying that this is not in fact a panacea when it comes to competition for investors?
But in fact, I don't believe in niche areas.
Okay.
In another occasion, I had to say pecunia non olet, which is a Latin way to say money doesn't smell.
Okay.
So, okay. So we need to be open. We need to be open to everything. And I would even look more at two traditional industries, two traditional big sectors that are disregarded. It is manufacturing and agriculture. We need that. And we are in a golden moment now to attract that kind of investments, because companies are running out of China. And the way in which China is reacting to Omicron is even pushing more companies to go out, because policies are crazy, extremely costly, and extremely restrictive. So investors that are still in China will keep on looking for better way to go. And again, as I mentioned, it is clear that concentrating all the manufacturing in one country was a mistake. So there are traditional manufacturing operations, logistic operations. We have fantastic port, and we have a big crisis in the logistic industry, whereby shipping containers, it costs 4 to 5 times more than what was costing before the pandemic. We need to take advantage of this outflow from China and be ready to offer something to manufacturing, agriculture company that move, a logistic company that move out of China. And we have something to offer as Malaysia. I think that we have still, in relative terms, the better infrastructural system in the region, if we exclude Singapore, that is a very small country. But the road system that we have in Malaysia, you don't have in the Philippines, you don't have it in Indonesia, you don't have it in Thailand, you don't have it in Vietnam. So the road system, the water system, good internet connection. Let's not forget, 100% of the population, almost 100%, is English speaking. This is an advantage. Aku malas cakap bahasa Melayu.
Okay.
Orang-orang faham bahasa Inggris.
Yeah.
No need
Yeah.
in Indonesia. Gak usah cakap bahasa Melayu. I can speak English. Everybody understand me. I go to the hospital. I go to the supermarket. So this is an enormous advantage that we can leverage about good hospitals. We need to rediscover that points and to eliminate the new things that we introduce, and further push on infrastructure, on physical infrastructure. Physical infrastructure is terribly underestimated, but the economy is made of physical things. It's not everything in the internet. You don't make bread on the internet.
Okay. Yeah, I have to make this point, Doctor, because you keep on saying you're referring to the word we. So for the benefit of my audience, saya rasa apabila Dr. CARMELO menyebut we, he is being Malaysian at heart. Because he has been operating in Malaysia since
ada
batik. Itu batik Melayu Malaysia, itu bukan batik Indonesia.
Melayu, ya. Istri saya marah.
Marah, itu bukan batik Indonesia. I have to establish that, Doctor, because looking at your name, Carmelo Perlito, you are an Italian. You're still a nationality wise. You're still Italian.
Yeah, still.
All right. So you have been here since 2011, and your wife is an Indonesian. So whenever he says we, I think that's why there was a slight smile just now, because I noticed that. Oh, okay. My audience, when he is listening to you, who are you referring to? Are you referring to?
Kami orang Malaysia. Malaysia.
I have to establish that. Thank you very much, Doctor. But by the way, since we're talking about this, you're talking about manufacturing and agriculture. If again, Indonesia is doing it right. I think it was in 2019 or maybe early 2020. I think Jokowi established in Sumatra, Ladang Rakyat, a huge effort in securing and trying to to address the issue of food security, whereby in Malaysia, I think I've been interviewing ministers every now and then, come and go, keep on talking about food security, but even orang kata jadi apa, lembu dalam kondo, you know the stories already. So all these things, you know, good ideas, but it has failed to manifest itself when it comes to implementation over here in Malaysia, even in agricultural sector, Doktor.
Aku fikir orang-orang tak boleh faham food security.
Okay.
Food security, and I work since 2009 in agriculture as well, with many agriculture company, in particular in the poultry industry. So I know the poultry industry very well.
All right.
People think that food security means to be able to produce everything by yourself.
Okay.
This is a huge mistake. Jokowi on this did a huge mistake. I did a research on this in 2019, 18 or 19, when Jokowi said, because Indonesia has the same problem of having a large production of chicken, but not enough production of feed. Feed is basically imported, same like in Malaysia. So they said we need to have our local production of feed. By pushing that, it turned out that the price of locally made feed was double the price of feed on the international market. So you are not helping your people. You are making chicken more expensive. So you are harming the poor. So when we talk about food security, we talk about access to cheaper and better food. Okay. And this doesn't mean to produce everything internally. We tried to do that during the fascist era with the concept of autarky. Autarky means being self-sufficient. But you need to be realistic on the condition of your soil, of your climate, of what you can do. So how is it possible that the Malaysian poultry industry is completely self-sufficient in producing chicken, but they are not able to produce feed? Obviously, if poultry entrepreneurs have been so smart with chicken, if it was economical to produce feed in the country, they would have done so already since many decades. Because to possess the feed mill is the crucial part of the value chain. So if it didn't happen, it means that it is not economically possible. So the best way to achieve food security is free trade. You are dependent on feed for your poultry industry. You need to have your poultry producer to have access to cheap feed. So you need to sit down with the government of the country that produce feed and set a free trade agreement to get access to feed. I think that Maidin also, Mr. Maidin recently said something in this line when he asked to open the licenses of importing chicken, because that is the only way to make chicken cheaper, to have more supply of chicken. If you remain a closed market, then you are operating in the opposite direction of food security. You don't achieve food security with being self-sufficient in producing everything, because that is an utopia, even for Indonesia. Because, I mean, agriculture still requires a certain weather. And weather, we are not God. We have no power on the weather. So.
At the moment when you're mentioning about free trade, it raised one red flag. Because over here, in particular Malaysia, we're talking about Bumiputra, we're talking about local entrepreneurs, local players. So what's your vision of free trade that will secure the interests of local smaller players at the same time? How do we go about in doing that?
This is obviously a controversial thing, and I want to clarify that I'm not very much in favor of the Trans-Pacific Agreement.
CPTPP.
Exactly, because that is not a free trade agreement.
All right.
A free trade agreement, a real free trade agreement is made of one line. I can have access to your market, you can have access to my market. Signature 1, signature 2. That is a free trade agreement. A free trade agreement made of thousands of pages obviously is not a free trade agreement. At the same time, I understand the concern of smaller players, but we can't expect the Malaysian economy to grow and to become internationally competitive if it doesn't get exposed to competition. The only way that you have to grow is to be exposed to competition. and we have successful examples. I have in mind, again, because I know it well, the poultry industry in Malaysia is terribly competitive. It adopts the highest standard of technology. It is adopting technology at European standards, and if they can be able for export. So on this sense, really Malaysia can be an halal hub, like it has been said many times. So exposition to competition is the best way also to having the local economy to mature and to evolve in the direction of modernity.
I would like to raise another question from Almayon. He's referring to China. We know about the Road and Belt Initiative. It's just that I would like to extend a bit his question, because I noticed that Indonesia, since at the very beginning we are comparing Indonesia and Malaysia, it seems like they are making even bolder steps in making a statement that we are now partnering with China. Where else in Malaysia we're a bit apprehensive. We were not really certain whether nak buddy-buddy dengan Indonesia, dengan China ataupun dengan Amerika. It seems like they are making even a bolder statement. They just make it clear it's going to be China, because both countries are very populous country, so it makes sense for them to have a direct, stronger relation economy. So, but Malaysia is a bit, shy away in establishing which one is a bigger partner. Is this a problem?
Indonesia is also flirting behind the door with the United States very much.
Okay, so you have had that being put in the presentation, to the diplomats here in Ipoh.
They are, I would say, like a beautiful girl that is flirting on many fronts, knowing, leveraging on their beauty, So,
okay, that's a good analogy.
Having said that, I think that the relationship with China needs to be taken very cautiously, and I think Malaysia is doing good in not jumping into the arms of China. For a reason, I've been in China for business reasons many times, in particular between 2013 and 2014. The China economy is not as solid as it wants to appear. And in 2014, I published an opinion article in which I was anticipating a real estate crisis in China. At that time, not many people paid attention to it, but now I'm happy to see that, unfortunately, my prophecy was true. So it's a giant with a very fragile economy, a very high level of corporate debt, and this is very risky. So big companies are doing business with borrowed money. They don't have resources. They are not financially healthy. And furthermore, when you want to do business together, you need to accept a common set of rules. If you play soccer with someone, you have both to accept that kicking the opposite player in the stomach is not acceptable, and if you are going to do that, you are going to be punished. So playing soccer is based on the acceptance of a set of rules from both parts, from both teams. So in dealing for my customers in business negotiations in China, I had the impression that in many cases they don't embrace that set of rules that are implied in the free economy, in the capitalistic system, intended not only as a set of economic rules, but also as a set of moral values, if you want. So what Adam Smith called also the rule of sympathy and fairness and etc. So they have a different background, and I think this that's why I would be very careful in jumping into the arms of China.
Yeah, but even Malaysia, especially in the previous administration, Prime Minister 6, Najib, we were flirting with China as well. So you can see the kind of infrastructure investment down south. So did we make the same mistake based on the rules that you're mentioning just now?
I would say that obviously you have to deal with the country because it's the giant in the region. It has the resources, but you have to be very careful on the terms and conditions. So even if they are written in a very small font, in a very small character, be sure that you read carefully all the terms and conditions, so you are able eventually to. And of course, when you play in your own country, then you are somehow secured by your system of rule of law. But again, there has been a situation of investments made by China in Sri Lanka, in example, or in Pakistan, to quote another example, that are putting those countries in troubles and in a difficult financial positions toward China.
If I may
consider that
reconstruct,
just to conclude, consider that we don't know how China produced the money that they have. So how much, if they are printed or they are money coming out of a sound economic system. So that money is dangerous.
Okay. There is a follow-up question from Farid Osman with regards to the food security just now. Farid is asking, does that mean having a resilient supply chain is key to food security? The pandemic has seen the supply chain disruption.
Precisely, supply chain is very, very important, and that's why free trade is a way to preserve a healthy and resilient supply chain. Being part of network of free trade agreements is very important. This doesn't mean, obviously, to try to be able to produce something that before you were not able to produce. I believe that on this there is a lot of room for growth. In example, in the Malaysian Borneo, in Sabah and Sarawak, I think there's not been enough consideration about how to properly exploit agricultural resources there from an economic perspective. But definitely the supply chain is key because all the different steps are very much connected. The way in which the way in which you grow chicken depends also on the possibility of motor manufacturers to supply the motors that run the feed system that feed the chicken, the bolt and nuts as well, not simply seeds.
Right. Now, last, if I'm not mistaken, it was in November last year. I think the Prime Minister launched the draft of NIA, its National Investment Aspirations. I'm not so sure why it was a draft being launched by the Prime Minister, but I'm not. Maybe it was just an effort trying to address the concern that there is an outflow of investment. So they make an announcement, NIA, but I see very little impact on the share market. But nevertheless, how best do we move forward? Since the competition is clear, and Indonesia in particular, of course, they have a bigger landmass and cheaper labor and cheaper cost of production. And it's not just about Indonesia, but it's also about Malaysia being a global player with all this changing at the unprecedented speed and also post-pandemic era. That perhaps may be my last question. What is the next best logical effort to be made by Malaysia in while at the same time we're having this political instability, and I think it's going to perpetuate up until maybe by end of this year, looking at the current scenario.
Yeah, but probably I think that elections could be a healthy solution in this moment because they could give a government that is actually chosen by the people, so free from misunderstanding. So a passage through democracy, I think, is welcome and will help also to clarify the scenario. Having said that, I think that if we want to close with a slogan, we should rediscover what made Malaysia an attractive hub in the past. This was a mix of good infrastructure, a good system, and openness. Openness is in the DNA of Malaysia. Being a small country, the only way to attract investment is to remain open. So Malaysia needs to rediscover that vocation to openness.
Right. So you are also doing consulting to many agencies here locally. Did you mention that slogan to them? It was just a passing question. What makes Malaysia great investment?
How to make Malaysia great again.
Great again. It sounds like MAGA. I don't want to use that. It reminds me of somebody else. I don't want to use MAGA. No. Thank you very much, Dr. Thank you, Dr. CARMELO.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Definitely, this is not the last, the first and the last, because I can see there are many angles. There are many follow-up questions need to be asked. with regards all the side steps topics that we have just mentioned during the 1 hour or so. So thank you once again. Terima kasih banyak Dr. Carmelo dan terima kasih kepada semua penonton pada malam ini. Kita jumpa lagi dalam kesempatan akan datang. InsyaAllah jumpa lagi. Assalamualaikum dan salam muhibah. See you next
Selamat
time.
malam dan selamat tidur.
Terima kasih.
Terima kasih.